So today we'll be looking at how EQ modulation and effects can turn the simplest sound into something more complex and interesting. So we start with the bass sound of just a saw wave being pitched around. And then through layering effects, we create something more interesting. So instead of starting from scratch, I'm just going to go through all the effects that I've put onto this to create the sound. So one of the things I've kind of learned through resampling and creating basses through effects and whatnot is that distortion, heavy distortion at least, always sounds best at the start of a process or a chain. So at the start, I've just got IVG, which is a free plugin. Doesn't really change that much. And then a wave shaper, just loudening up the sound. And then there's a fruity chorus, and the cross cutoff is at like 50,000 hertz. And that's just so it's not affecting the bass, because this is effectively just widening the sound. Then there's a Camel Crusher, which is just on the default setting. There's another free plugin. I think I might have moved some stuff around, or maybe not at all. And then there's another wave shaper. Then there's a wow filter, which is only on 50% mix. It's just starting off the kind of vowel-y movement. Then there's another wow filter, which is on band reject instead of the comb filter. And it's barely doing anything because the mix is quite down. But instead of modulating the frequency of the cutoff, it's modulating the resonance. If I put the mix up all the way, it's creating this almost nasally effect. And it sounds cool, but when I did a lot of EQ modulation, I actually thought it sounded better at a lower mix. The next effect is Forma 8, which is a kind of vocoding thing, or it applies vocal qualities to something through filtering, and it's basically a vowel morphing filter or something. And it's free, and I think the X and the Y is being modulated here. But the mix is really low down, like if I put that up. And then after this, there's not EQ modulation straight away, there's more distortion using FabFilter Saturn. And then there's a patcher. There's EQ modulation here, then a bit more distortion. And if we look at the first EQ modulation, it's not a bandpass, but it effectively is, kind of, because the whole sound's being brought down 18 decibels, and then this point here is being brought back up 18. But then there's another point that's moving, and essentially what is a band reject and all this other stuff. And if I play it, you get the start of something really cool. And then there's distortion, and just look at that. There's a very low mix on these Camel Crushers. And then the next EQ is also modulating things, but it's being brought down less. But it's like the peaks and stuff are still being brought up 18. The ones that I want to accentuate the most are being brought up the most, essentially. And they're being moved to create these kind of vowel-y, vocal-y aspects to the sound. And then there's some compression. It doesn't really need to be multiband, because the way I've used it just compresses the whole sound the same. I just use multiband because then with the highs I can separate the audio so it seems wider, and in the lows completely mono it. And then there's another Fab filter, but this one's using a tip that Frequent gave in his Bass Gorilla podcast thing, where he said to move the frequencies, like the bands of what's being distorted. So I did that. You can't really, it doesn't show it moving, but this X mod is attached to here and here. And the other thing that's being modulated is the feedback. And and it's being modulated in a way that the higher frequencies get the feedback, so there's not really any in the low, because that would sound kind of just bad and muddy. Other than the feedback, it's not incredibly important to the sound. And then in the next patcher, there's more EQ modulation. Instead of just a serial setup, this one's got 2 parallel filters. So this one by itself just sounds like that. And it's just accentuating the frequencies that sound cool, basically. And then this top one's going through a chorus, which is, again, got a cutoff that's above about 125 to 150 hertz is generally what I keep mono. And this one just sounds like this. One of the things about EQ modulation is that for every successive EQ that you put onto the sound and that you modulate, you don't want to be modulating the same frequencies, because there's really no point. You could just make, like, if I was to follow this one with a successive EQ, say this one, right? And I did essentially the same movement in the second one, I may as well just, like, boost this one more by, like, adding another EQ following it, another point following it or something. So for every successive one, there's different movement, similar movement, but different, to create kind of a more complex texture to the sound. And then this one here is actually a bandpass, and it's got a lot less frequencies. It sounds a lot more focused. And the reason I don't put a lot of bandpasses and strict, like, band rejects in previous filtering chains is because you need to compress it a lot to get the full spectrum again. And by doing that, you get a lot of compression artifacts that generally just sound terrible and you want to avoid. So then when you combine these two EQs, you get, which is basically the finished sound. And then there's another wave shaper with the mix is only up like a tiny bit. And then a final EQ, which is just dipping like 240. With the final EQ, I like to just dip around 200 to 400 hertz because they generally don't sound great. And then after you've done this, you can then, like, record this and put it into Harmor, because or something like that, or just record the sound and put more and more effects on it. I'll put the FOP in the description. And if you don't have WoW filter or Saturn, there's not really much of a difference to the sound if I turn them off. So yeah.